So how do you work with time constraints in a sermon? You sometimes can't control how much time is allotted for you to preach, but you can do some things to make sure that in the moment you're not inhibited from listening to the Holy Spirit and following His guidance. In this video, I'm going to give you 3 things that you can do to work within time constraints in your sermon and to make your sermon even more effective within the restraints and even maybe because of the restraints. For that, stick around. My name is Lane. This is Preaching Donkey. It's so awesome to have you joining me today. I want to put something in your hands that will be a great complement to this video. It's my 21-day guide to creating killer sermons. You can pick that up at preachingdonkey.com/21 days, totally free. It's my gift to you. So let's get right into this. When it comes to the subject of time constraints, I got this really insightful question from one of my subscribers. Here's what he said. He said, my sermon challenge is the inability to time my messages, my sermon. Most times a beautiful sermon will have to be ended abruptly because of time constraints. So maybe you have dealt with this too, where you are preaching a sermon and you realize, oh man, my time is up. I gotta end this thing. You look at the clock, maybe you haven't been paying much attention to it, and all of a sudden you realize, I've got 5 minutes left, but I've got 15 more minutes of content. Then you got to start deciding, well, what's important? What do I leave in? What do I take out? Then maybe you've already gone long. Maybe you've already gone 10, 15 minutes over, and you realize that you're losing your people. They're starting to kind of doze off, or they're inattentive. And so you just know that even though you don't have to land the plane, you really should land the plane, but you're a little bit frustrated because, your sermon hasn't been as disciplined as it should have been with the time. Or maybe you're just saying, you know what, I've been responsive to the Holy Spirit in the moment, and I don't want to end this message, but I feel like I don't have a choice because I've either lost the people or I have to because maybe you have multiple services like my church does. And so you've got to kind of shut this down so that we can get the other people in. Whatever the case, it can be very frustrating. So I want to give you 3 things that you can do ahead of time to make sure that this isn't a problem. The first thing is always rehearse your sermons. Now, this is something that's difficult for experienced preachers to understand why it's so necessary even for them. But this is especially necessary if you're a novice, if you're brand new to preaching. But I would argue, even if you've been preaching for a long time, rehearsing is very important when it comes to time. And the reason why is because when you rehearse a message, and by rehearse, what I mean say every word you're going to say, all right? Look at your notes, stand up if you need to. I like to do it in the room. I like to feel what it's going to feel like in the room. But say, regardless of that, you could do it in your office, you could do it in your car, on your commute, whatever the case, but say every word you plan on saying. Your introduction, all the points you're going to make, your bottom line, read the text, tell the stories, all of it. And the reason why, many reasons why it's really helpful to rehearse. One of them is time. When you rehearse, there's 2 things that tend to go longer than you think. One is the introduction, and 2 is the stories or illustrations that you tell. So just by rehearsing, you're able to see man, I went 9 minutes on my introduction, and I really, in my mind, only planned for about 5 minutes. Well, that just kind of puts me a little bit behind for the rest of the sermon. Or the story about the first date I had with my wife, I put that in my notes as story about first date. I didn't realize that it's actually about a 5 or 6 minute story, and that's 5 or 6 minutes that I don't have elsewhere in my sermon, if that makes sense. And so it's really helpful to some of these things that can kind of get obscured in your preparation, where it's like, oh, mention this or say this or tell this story or give this illustration. When you actually rehearse it, it becomes longer than you thought. And you're able to make adjustments if you do this ahead of time. Because the second thing you do, in addition to rehearsing, is make sure that you have a range of time and aim for the bottom end of the range. So for example, let's say that you're the lead pastor of your church. So in a lot of ways, how long your sermon is up to you. I mean, you can say, I'm going to preach for 35 minutes, or you can say, I'm going to preach for 20, or you're going to say, I'm going to preach for 45. It's really in your court. In some traditions, your tradition may dictate that. The liturgy may dictate that. But if you have a situation where you have the freedom to determine how long you're going to preach, then my suggestion is set a range, not a hard time. So in other words, you might tell your people, I'm going to preach, or people that plan your services, the people that need to know, you might say, I'm going to preach for between 30 and 40 minutes, for example, 30 and 40 minutes. So I could go up to 40, but it's going to be at least 30. And then when you prepare, aim for 30 minutes. Set all of your preparation for 30 minutes. Make it so that your rehearsal is aimed at 30 minutes. And what that does is it allows you 10 minutes of flexible time during the message, so that if you really get inspired and you want to say something that you didn't think of during your rehearsal or during your preparation, which happens, it's part of preaching, you have the freedom to do that without cutting anything else out. And it could be 30 to 40, or it could be 25 to 35, or it could be 15 to 20. The range is really up to you. My point is, set a range and aim for the lower end of the time. It just gives you more freedom and flexibility. So number 1 is rehearse. Number 2 is set a range and aim for the bottom end of it. And then finally, number 3 is learn from each sermon and make adjustments. And so what you're going to do as you do this is you're going to start to see patterns of, okay, I tend to go long here, or I tend to lose track of time when I'm making these kind of points, or I tend to get lost in the text and I forget to say things that I should have said, or I say more than I thought I was going to say. And so you can kind of prepare for, this is what kind of makes me preach longer than I should. This is what makes me kind of cut the sermon off short. And so you can make adjustments along the way. So as you're rehearsing and as you're shooting for this range, you start to learn things and you can make adjustments. The point is, there isn't any one sermon that's going to just be perfect and fix this problem forever. This is a process. It's a lifetime. It's a journey. And so what I have found is that if I just look at every single sermon, watch it back, and try to learn from it, then it makes it better in the future. So those are my thoughts. I would love for you to share in the comments, how much time do you preach? How have you dealt with time constraints? What's it like in your tradition? I do know that some traditions do not have time constraints, and that's really fine and cool. A lot of traditions do, just because of the logistics of getting people in and out. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Definitely subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet, and I will see you in the next video.